There's a word for what's happening in Florida right now, and the people doing it made it up themselves. Halfbacks. Retirees who moved all the way south to Florida decided it wasn't working and went halfway back north instead. Last year, Florida took in about 45,700 retirees and lost about 44,900, a net gain of 815 people for the entire state, which knocked Florida clean out of the top 10 for senior migration. The reason isn't the sunshine. It's a homeowner's insurance bill that now averages over $7,000 a year, the highest in the country, up from around $4,200 just 3 years earlier. Tonight, I'm counting down 20 southern towns where that money went instead, from the Georgia lakes up through Tennessee and into the Carolinas, and every single one sits in a state that never touches your Social Security check. Let's see what we got. The cheapest way into this entire list runs through a town that calls itself the watermelon capital of the world and means it. Cordell sits in Crisp County in South Georgia, about halfway between Macon and Albany, and the typical home here costs $145,000 on Zillow's June index. That is the lowest number you will hear tonight by a wide margin, and it is roughly 70 average Social Security checks for an entire house. What makes Cordell more than a cheap address is the water 8 miles west of town. Lake Blackshear covers 8,500 acres of cypress-lined shoreline along the Flint River, with a state park on its edge, and the whole thing sits close enough that a retiree can keep a boat and still walk to a grocery store. Georgia's tax treatment is the quiet part that matters more than the lake. Social Security is exempt from state income tax entirely, and beginning at 65, the state lets you exclude up to $65,000 of other retirement income per person, which for most couples living on a check and a modest pension means the state's cut rounds to nothing. Crisp Regional Hospital keeps a full facility in town, which for a county this size is not a given. Now, the honest part, and in South Georgia, it arrives in July. Summers here are long, flat, and genuinely humid in a way that a Florida transplant will recognize and a Michigan transplant will not. So anyone fleeing heat should keep driving north through this list. What you get for staying is arithmetic almost nowhere else in the country can match. Run the comparison that this whole video is built on, and it gets stark. The national average homeowners insurance premium runs about $2,500 a year. Florida's now sits above $7,000. On a Cordell house worth the fraction of a Florida coastal equivalent, that premium line alone can swing several $100s a month in a retiree's budget, and it swings in the direction of the person who left. The rest of the town runs on the rhythms you would expect. The Veterans State Park on the lake keeps a golf course, the Sam Shortline excursion train still runs out of the depot on weekends, and every summer the watermelon crop turns the highway shoulders into roadside stands. Nobody moves to Cordell for excitement. People move here because a paid-off house and a boat cost less than a mortgage payment somewhere else, and because South Georgia's winters barely happen. Toccoa Falls drops 186 feet through a wooded gorge on a college campus at the edge of town, which makes it taller than Niagara, a fact the locals would tell you inside about 4 minutes of meeting you. The town wrapped around it sits in Stevens County in the northeast Georgia foothills, close to the South Carolina line and the bottom edge of the Blue Ridge, and the typical home runs $233,000 on the June index. That price buys elevation, which is the entire reason a halfback would stop here instead of pushing on. Toccoa sits high enough that summer nights actually cool off. The fall color arrives properly in October, and the air has none of the wet weight that runs the length of the Georgia coastal plain. Lake Hartwell spreads out 15 minutes east, 56,000 acres shared with South Carolina, deep enough for real boats and big enough that it never feels crowded on a Tuesday. The tax math is the same Georgia math that made Cordell work. No state tax on your check, and up to $65,000 of other retirement income excluded once you turn 65. Stevens County Hospital handles the routine locally, with Anderson and Greenville a manageable drive across a state line for anything serious. The counterweight is scale. This is a town of about 8,500 people, so the restaurant list is short. The shopping means a drive to Gainesville, and if you need an airport, Atlanta's nearly 2 hours down the interstate. Waterfall out the back door though, that trade closes itself for some people. There's a second layer of history here most visitors never learn. During the Second World War, Camp Toccoa at the foot of Currahee Mountain trained the paratroopers who became the Easy Company of Band of Brothers fame, and the mountain they ran up every morning still stands at the edge of town, with a trail to the top that locals climb for the view. That kind of story tends to keep a small town's civic pride intact long after the economy that built it moved on, and you can feel it in a downtown that has held on to its brick storefronts rather than letting them hollow out. For a retiree, the practical read is simple. $233,000 buys a real house in the foothills. The elevation does the air conditioning for you most of the year, and the state takes nothing off the top of your monthly check. Here's a statistic that tells you more than any brochure could. Roughly 1 in 4 people living in Blairsville is 65 or older. That is not an accident of an aging rural county. That is a town retirees keep choosing on purpose. Tucked into Union County at the top of Georgia, where the Appalachians finally get serious. Brasstown Bald, the highest point in the state, rises just outside town. Vogel State Park, one of Georgia's oldest, sits at the foot of Blood Mountain a few miles south. The Appalachian Trail crosses the highway close enough that through hikers wander into town for a real meal. The typical home costs $391,000 on the June index, the priciest Georgia entry tonight, and the mountains are exactly why. At almost 2,000 feet, Blairsville runs 10 to 15 degrees cooler than Atlanta on a summer afternoon, which is the single thing a Florida refugee is actually shopping for. Union General Health System keeps a hospital right in town, unusual for a mountain county this small, and that alone rearranges the map for anyone who has ever priced out a rural retirement. And a quick word while we're up here in the cool air. If you're finding this useful, subscribing costs you nothing, which puts it in a very short category alongside Georgia's tax on your Social Security check. Back to the mountains. The honest counterweight is winter, because snow does fall up here and the roads wind, so a retiree who plans to drive at 80 needs to think about that grade in January. The rest of the year, this is the version of the South that people who hate the South actually like. The town square is small enough to walk in 10 minutes and has kept a working courthouse, a few restaurants, and a farmer's market that runs most of the year on mountain produce. Lake Notley wraps around the north edge of town, a Tennessee Valley Authority reservoir with enough shoreline that boat access is genuinely easy rather than theoretical. What the 24% number really tells you is that the infrastructure has already adjusted. The doctors here are used to Medicare paperwork, the clubs and volunteer groups are full of people the same age, and nobody treats a 68-year-old newcomer like an oddity, which is a quieter kind of amenity than a golf course, but shows up in daily life far more often. Cross in Tennessee, and the tax picture stops being generous and starts being absolute. There is no state income tax here at all on anything, so your Social Security check, your pension, and every dollar you pull from a retirement account arrive untouched by Nashville. Athens sits in McMinn County in the southeast corner of the state, halfway between Chattanooga and Knoxville, and the typical home costs $268,000 on Zillow's June figure. The town's draw is the water east of it. Watts Bar Lake and the Tennessee River wrap the county's edge, and Tennessee National, a golf community built along that shoreline between the Smoky Mountain foothills and the river, has pulled in exactly the buyer this video's about. Athens itself keeps a courthouse square that still functions as one, with a Friday night high school football culture and a small college, Tennessee Wesleyan, that puts lectures and concerts on the calendar. Star Regional Medical Center covers the hospital column in town, and both Chattanooga and Knoxville sit under an hour and a half for specialists. What sells this place to a halfback is a combination almost nobody advertises: zero state income tax, a lake with 700 miles of shoreline, a real hospital, and a house that costs less than a third of what a coastal Florida equivalent run after insurance. The catch is that southeast Tennessee summers still bring heat and humidity, just less of both than the Gulf, and a Florida transplant expecting mountain air will need to drive another hour east to find it. Athens trades scenery for arithmetic. Plenty of people make that trade knowingly. Consider what no state income tax actually does over a retirement rather than over a year. A couple drawing 2 Social Security checks plus $40,000 from a pension and retirement accounts might hand a graduated tax state several $1,000s annually on that second slice of income. In Tennessee, that number is zero every year for as long as you live here, and it compounds into a genuinely different retirement by the time you are 80. Watts Bar itself is a sleeper amenity, 700 miles of shoreline along the Tennessee River, warm enough for a long boating season and quiet enough on a weekday that the fishing pressure stays low. The Cherokee National Forest rises east of the county for hiking. This is the kind of place a person finds because they were driving between two cities and stopped for lunch. Most people have never heard of the largest wind tunnel complex on Earth, and fewer still know it sits in a middle Tennessee town of about 20,000 people. Arnold Engineering Development Complex on the edge of Tullahoma has tested nearly every American aircraft and rocket engine of the past 70 years, and that single federal installation gave this town something almost no rural retirement destination has, which is a professional class, an engineering payroll, and the services that follow both. The typical home costs $298,000 on Zillow's June index. Where that matters for our retiree is healthcare, because Vanderbilt Tullahoma Heart and Hospital sits right here, tied into one of the strongest academic medical systems in the South, and that connection means specialist referrals do not require a 2-hour drive and a hotel room. The downtown has spent the past decade turning itself walkable, with an art center, a restored theater, and a depot museum. Water is 15 minutes away in either direction. Timms Ford Lake southwest with a state park and deep clear water, Normandy Lake northeast. Tennessee's zero income tax applies here the same as everywhere else in the state, so a check and a pension both land whole. The honest counterweight is that Middle Tennessee summers are hot and humid, closer to Nashville's climate than to the mountains, and the town's flat terrain gives you none of the elevation relief that the eastern half of the state sells. What Tullahoma sells instead is competence, a serious hospital, a real downtown, 2 lakes, and a tax bill that stopped at the federal line. For a retiree who has already decided that scenery matters less than not driving 90 minutes to see a cardiologist, that is a fair trade and an underpriced one. There is a quieter benefit to a federal installation town that nobody puts in a brochure either. Places built around a government facility tend to have stable property values and a population that has been arriving from elsewhere for generations, which means a newcomer with no local family history is not treated as an outsider. That matters more than people expect. Plenty of rural southern towns are lovely to visit and quietly close to anyone whose grandparents are buried somewhere else. Tullahoma is not one of them because half the town moved here for a job at some point in the last 70 years. Wattsbar Lake has 700 miles of shoreline, and Kingston sits at the point where the Clinch River and the Emory River both empty into it, which gives this town of 6,000 more waterfront per resident than almost anywhere in the eastern half of the state. The typical home runs $341,000 on the June index, a step up from Athens 45 minutes south, and the water is the reason. What you are buying at that price is a boat in the driveway life without a coastal insurance bill, which is precisely the swap this entire video is about. A Florida waterfront property now carries a homeowner's premium averaging over $7,000 a year statewide and hurricane deductibles that are calculated as a percentage of the home's value rather than a flat number. A lake house in Roane County carries neither of those problems. There is no named storm deductible on Watts Bar. Kingston's own history runs deeper than the lake, because for one single day in 1792, this town served as the capital of Tennessee, a legislative technicality the locals have never once let go of, and the old courthouse square still anchors downtown. Bacon Ridge Trail runs from the edge of town for hiking, and Roane County keeps a hospital in nearby Harriman, with Knoxville's major systems about 40 minutes northeast. The counterweight here is the same one that shadows a lot of this stretch of Tennessee. The county's economy is thin outside of the lake and the retirees who came for it. Restaurant options rotate rather than grow, and a genuinely bad winter storm can make the ridge roads unpleasant for a few days. But if the picture in your head involves a dock, a coffee, and morning fog burning off the water, this is that picture at a third of the coastal price. It helps that the Tennessee Valley Authority built these lakes for flood control and power, rather than for resort development, which means the shoreline was never carved into wall-to-wall condominium towers the way a Florida waterfront was. Large stretches stay wooded and publicly held. The practical effect for a homeowner is that the view from your dock in 20 years will probably look like the view today, and that is a form of security no insurance policy sells. Kingston also sits inside easy reach of the rest of East Tennessee. The Smokies are about 2 hours east and Oak Ridge 15 minutes north. Tennessee's oldest town was chartered in 1779, 17 years before Tennessee itself became a state, and Jonesboro has spent the 2 centuries since refusing to let anyone tear down the evidence. The historic district runs several blocks of brick and clapboard storefronts along Main Street, all of it still in daily use rather than preserved behind glass, and the typical home costs $345,000 on Zillow's June index. What makes this town genuinely unusual is what it decided to be famous for. The International Storytelling Center is headquartered here, and every October the National Storytelling Festival brings tens of thousands of people into a town of 6,000 for a weekend of tents, chairs, and people simply telling stories out loud. That is either the most charming thing you have ever heard or completely baffling, and which one it is will tell you whether you belong here. Cost of living in this corner of the state sits well below the national average, with housing running roughly 30% under the national line, which on a fixed income does more work than any amenity. Johnson City is 15 minutes east with Ballad Health's Regional Medical Center, so healthcare is genuinely close. And a quick one before we keep going, since we're in the storytelling capital of America. Subscribing takes 1 second, costs nothing, and unlike the festival, it does not require a folding chair. Back to it. The honest note is that Jonesboro is small and it knows it, so a retiree who needs a mall, an airport, or a symphony will be driving to Johnson City or Knoxville for all three. What stays is a town where the walk to get a coffee passes buildings older than the state. The geography helps more than the brochures admit. Jonesboro sits in the valley between the Appalachian Ridges at around 1,700 feet, which keeps summer afternoons from turning brutal and puts real fall color on the hillsides every October. Rowan Mountain is an hour southeast, and Asheville is close enough for a day out without being close enough to push prices up. One more practical detail. Northeast Tennessee is a dense cluster of small towns rather than one dominant city, so medical, retail, and cultural infrastructure spreads across Johnson City, Kingsport, and Bristol rather than sitting an hour away. For a retiree who will eventually stop wanting to drive long distances, that distribution is worth more than any single amenity a bigger city could offer. The single strongest number in this entire countdown belongs to a community just outside of Crossville, and it is this. The median age in Fairfield Glade is 70. Not 65, not 68, 70. Fairfield Glade sits on the Cumberland Plateau at the northern edge of Crossville, a planned community of roughly 9,000 people that has grown by more than 3,000 residents in a single decade. And it exists almost entirely because retirees keep choosing it. 5 championship golf courses sit inside it, which is part of why Crossville itself carries the nickname of Tennessee's golf capital, and 11 lakes are scattered through the property. The typical Crossville home costs $314,000 on the June index. What draws people to the plateau specifically is elevation, because Crossville sits around 2,000 feet, high enough that summers run noticeably cooler than Nashville or Knoxville on either side, and high enough that the 4 seasons actually show up in order. For a Florida transplant who spent a decade running the air conditioning 11 months a year, that alone closes a sale. Tennessee's zero income tax does the rest, and Cumberland Medical Center, part of the Covenant Health System, keeps a full hospital in town rather than an hour away. The honest counterweight is that a planned retirement community is a specific kind of life, with property owners association dues, amenity fees, and neighbors who are all roughly your age. And some people find that comforting while others find it claustrophobic within about 8 months. There is no middle ground on that question, and it is worth answering honestly before you shop. But the median age of 70 is not an accident. It is thousands of individual people running this exact math and reaching the same conclusion. Worth noting too that Crossville is not only Fairfield Glade. The Cumberland County Playhouse has staged professional theater here since the 1960s and draws audiences from 3 states, and Cumberland Mountain State Park sits just south. The interstate runs through, putting Knoxville and Nashville each about 90 minutes off in opposite directions. That combination is rarer than it sounds. Most southern places with genuinely cool summers are deep in the mountains and hard to reach, and most places that are easy to reach are hot. The plateau manages elevation and interstate access at once, and the retirement industry figured that out decades ago. 7,000 people live inside a single development in Loudoun County, and every one of them chose it. Tellico Village spreads across 4,800 acres along the shoreline of Tellico Lake in the foothills of the Great Smoky Mountains. And since it opened in 1987, it has grown into one of the largest and most established retirement communities in the entire Southeast. 3 golf courses sit inside it, each with its own clubhouse, along with 3 recreation centers, a private country club, and more than 200 social clubs and volunteer organizations, which is the detail that actually matters. A person who moves here at 68 knowing nobody will have a calendar inside a month. The typical Loudoun home costs $505,000 on Zillow's June index, the second highest number tonight. And that price is the honest cost of a turnkey retirement rather than a fixer in a small town. What you are buying is a lake, a mountain view, and an entire social infrastructure that already exists. Residents here come from every corner of the country, which means the community is built for newcomers by design rather than by accident. Tennessee's zero state income tax applies, so a couple with a pension and retirement accounts keeps everything the federal government does not take. Knoxville sits about 40 minutes northeast for its hospital systems and its airport. The honest counterweight is the price and the fees, because a planned community of this size runs on property owners association dues and amenity charges that continue every year whether you golf or not. And a retiree working from a fixed check needs to price those in before falling in love with a lake view. There is a case to be made that a place like this is the most honest version of retirement planning available because everything is priced and disclosed up front. You know the dues, you know the amenities, you know roughly who your neighbors will be and roughly what the resale market looks like. And none of that is true when a person buys a random house in a random small town and hopes the community materializes. That certainty is what the $500,000 price tag is buying. And for a couple who sold a Florida house into a market where insurance had made buyers scarce, the number often works out closer than it looks. The Smokies are an hour east. On a clear morning, the ridgeline sits right there across the water. Cross into North Carolina and the tax picture changes shape. There is a state income tax here, a flat 3.99% for 2026, but it is already scheduled to fall to 2.99% by 2028, and Social Security is fully exempt regardless. Elizabeth City sits on the Pasquotank River in the northeast corner of the state, close enough to the Albemarle Sound that the water is tidal and close enough to the Outer Banks that a beach day is an easy morning drive. The town called itself the Harbor of Hospitality, a nickname it earned from a tradition of local boaters greeting transients coming down the Intracoastal Waterway. And that waterway is the reason a certain kind of retiree ends up here permanently. People stop on the way to Florida and never leave. The typical home costs $271,000 on the June index. What that buys is genuine waterfront access, a historic downtown with brick storefronts along the harbor, and a Coast Guard air station that gives the local economy a spine most towns this size do not have. Centara Albemarle Medical Center covers the hospital in town, with Norfolk's large systems about an hour north across the Virginia line. Compare the insurance map to coastal Florida and the case makes itself, because North Carolina's premiums, while not cheap on the coast, do not approach a Florida average that has climbed past $7,000 a year. The counterweight is that this is still hurricane geography, so wind coverage matters and the flood zone check is not optional. It is simply a smaller version of the same risk at a much smaller price. The Coast Guard presence deserves a second mention because of what it does to a small town's character. An air station means a steady rotation of families arriving from everywhere, retired service members settling permanently after a final posting, and the local economy that does not rise and fall with a single factory. Elizabeth City State University adds a second stabilizer, keeping a college calendar and a younger population in a town that would otherwise skew heavily older. For a retiree, the practical benefit is that the restaurants stay open and the downtown does not empty out in February the way a seasonal town does. The sound behind town is shallow, warm, and full of fish. An 1886 lighthouse sits on the waterfront in the middle of town, one of the last of its kind left standing anywhere in the Albemarle Sound, and it tells you most of what you need to know about Edenton. This was North Carolina's first colonial capital. The streets still run in their original grid, and the whole waterfront district has been preserved rather than rebuilt. The typical home costs $243,000 on Zillow's June index, which for a genuine historic waterfront town on the East Coast is a number that stops people mid-scroll. Queen Anne Park runs along the Sound with shaded paths and benches and views across open water, and the Outer Banks sit under 2 hours east when you want sand instead of sound. What makes Edenton work for the halfback specifically is that it delivers the coastal southern picture without any of the Florida pricing structure underneath it. The same money that buys a small inland condo in a Florida retirement community buys a whole house here within walking distance of the water. North Carolina exempts Social Security entirely, and its property tax relief programs for homeowners 65 and older can knock a meaningful piece off the annual bill for those who qualify by income. The honest note is size and services. Edenton has around 5,000 people, so the hospital situation means Chowan Regional Medical Center locally and a drive to Elizabeth City or Greenville for anything complicated. And the grocery and restaurant options are what a town this size supports. That trade buys you a $243,000 house on the water in a place George Washington actually visited. Edenton's history is heavier than its size suggests. In 1774, a group of local women signed a public statement refusing British tea, an act that got mocked in London newspapers at the time and is now remembered as one of the earliest organized political actions by women in the colonies. The town has kept that story alongside the harder ones. For daily life, what matters more is the pace. The waterfront is a 5-minute walk from most of the historic district, the Sound stays calm enough for small boats nearly year-round, and the local calendar runs on church suppers, the farmers market, and a Christmas candle night tour that fills every bed in town. It is a quieter life than the Florida version, deliberately so. Lake James holds 6,000 acres of clear water at the foot of the Blue Ridge Escarpment, and Morganton sits 20 minutes south of it in the Catawba River Valley with the mountains filling the northern horizon. The typical home costs $268,000 on the June index, and what makes this an unusually strong entry is that Morganton is a real town rather than a retirement product. Burke County seat has a courthouse square that fills for a summer concert series and a downtown with independent restaurants surviving on local customers instead of tourists. Elevation runs around 1,100 feet, enough to take the edge off August without committing to mountain winters. Pisgah National Forest starts just north and Linville Gorge is within an hour. UNC Health Blue Ridge runs the hospital in town, and Asheville's larger systems sit an hour west with Charlotte 90 minutes southeast, which means both a real airport and major specialists are reachable without relocating for treatment. And a quick word while we are standing between a lake and a mountain range, if this channel is doing the homework you would otherwise be doing yourself, subscribing is the entire payment I'm asking for, and it costs a good deal less than a Florida wind policy. Back to Morganton. The honest counterweight is that the foothills get genuinely cold snaps in January and the county's manufacturing base has thinned over the decades, so the local economy leans on healthcare and the schools. What has not thinned is the geography, which is the reason people keep arriving. There is a specific advantage to landing in the foothills rather than up on the ridge, and Morganton is the clearest example of it in this video. Full mountain towns deliver spectacular scenery and then hand you steep grades, icy roads for weeks, and grocery runs that become a project every January. The foothills give you the view without the commitment. Snow falls here and is generally gone in 2 days. The price gap is substantial too, because everyone shopping for a mountain retirement bids up the towns at 4,000 feet, while the ones at 1,100 sit there being practical. Two rivers meet in the middle of this town, and that confluence is why New Bern has spent 300 years being more important than its size suggests. The News and the Trent come together right at downtown. The Atlantic sits about 35 miles east, and the resulting waterfront gives a town of 30,000 a marina culture that a landlocked place cannot manufacture. The typical home costs $287,000 on Zillow's June index. New Bern was North Carolina's colonial capital, and Tryon Palace, the reconstructed 1770s royal governor's residence, anchors a historic district with the North Carolina History Center beside it. So the walkable part of town is genuinely walkable rather than 3 blocks of antique shops. This is also where Pepsi was invented, in a downtown pharmacy in 1893, a fact the town has monetized cheerfully ever since. For the halfback, the appeal is specific. You get real coastal southern living, warm water, boats, oysters, Spanish moss, without buying into a Florida market where the insurance premium can exceed the property tax by several multiples. Carolina East Health System runs a full medical center in town, which for a coastal community of this size is a genuine advantage. And it means the routine routine care that dominates a retiree's calendar happens locally. The honest counterweight is hurricanes, and New Bern has taken direct hits, most memorably during Florence in 2018, when the storm surge pushed water deep into the historic district. Flood zones here are not theoretical, and neither is the insurance conversation. But it is a conversation, rather than the arithmetical impossibility a comparable Florida address has become for many buyers on a fixed income. There is a reason New Bern shows up on more retirement lists than almost any other town in this video, and it is not the Palace or the Pepsi. It is that the town solved the problem most coastal retirement destinations never do, which is what to do on a Tuesday in February. The historic district gives you somewhere to walk when the boat is put away. The hospital and the medical practices around it mean the healthcare calendar does not require travel, and a population of 30,000 supports actual restaurants and actual grocery stores rather than seasonal ones. Compare that to a barrier island community that empties out after Labor Day, and the difference in daily life is enormous.
Waynesville sits in the gap between the Great Smoky Mountains and the Blue Ridge Parkway, which is a sentence that costs money almost everywhere else it could be written. The typical home runs $363,000 on the June index, and the town has been showing up on national retirement lists for years, including a Where to Retire magazine feature naming it among the best places in the country for hikers and walkers. That framing is exact. This is a town for people who intend to be outside. Elevation runs around 2,700 feet, high enough that summer afternoons stay in the 70s and low 80s while Atlanta bakes, and high enough that fall color arrives properly and stays for weeks. The parkway entrance is minutes away, the national park boundary is close enough for a morning hike, and the Pisgah Forest surrounds the county. Main Street has resisted becoming a souvenir strip, keeping bookstores, galleries, and restaurants that locals actually use, and the Haywood County Farmers Market runs deep into the season on mountain produce. Haywood Regional Medical Center handles the hospital in town, with Asheville's Mission Health 30 minutes east for anything larger. North Carolina exempts Social Security completely, and the state's flat income tax is on a scheduled path down to 2.99% by 2028. The counterweight is that Mountain North Carolina has been discovered, and prices reflect it. $363,000 is a real number for a retiree working from a check and a modest nest egg. And inventory moves quickly when something good lists. What you are competing for is one of the few places in the South where you can genuinely skip air conditioning in July. That climate point deserves more weight than a list format usually gives it, because for a Florida transplant, it is the entire reason for the move. A retiree who has spent 15 years indoors from May through September running an air conditioner that drives a utility bill and a life spent avoiding the outdoors arrives in a place like this and gets those months back. Porches become usable, gardens become possible. Walking at 2 in the afternoon stops being dangerous. That is not a lifestyle upgrade in the brochure sense, it is a measurable change in how many hours of the year a person is willing to leave the house. And at 70, that number matters. Waynesville also keeps more cultural programming than a town of 10,000 has any right to, including a ramp festival every spring and Folk Moot, an international dance and music festival that brings performing groups from around the world into the mountains every summer. The Blue Ridge Parkway closes in bad winter weather, and that is the honest seasonal limit here, but the town itself fits low enough in the valley that the roads stay open and the grocery run never becomes an expedition. Every so often, a place gets used as a movie set so often that people start recognizing it without knowing why, and Southport is that place. The town sits where the Cape Fear River meets the Atlantic at the southern tip of North Carolina's coast, all live oaks and porches and a waterfront that looks assembled by a location scout, which is precisely why film crews keep showing up. The typical home costs $415,000 on Zillow's June index. That is real money, and it is also considerably less than the coastal Florida equivalent once you put the insurance line into the comparison. Southport's practical appeal for a retiree is the combination of genuine ocean access, a walkable historic downtown, and a ferry to Fort Fisher that makes Wilmington reachable without the highway. Oak Island's beaches are minutes away, the fishing is serious, and the whole town runs at a pace that assumes nobody is in a hurry. North Carolina's property tax relief programs for homeowners 65 and older can reduce the annual bill meaningfully for those who meet the income test, and Social Security is untouched by the state regardless of what else you earn. Novant Health Brunswick Medical Center covers the hospital in nearby Bolivia, with Wilmington's larger systems about 40 minutes north. And a quick one from the coast. If you have made it to number 6 and you are still taking notes, subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of list that gets more useful the more of it you have seen. Back to Southport.
The counterweight is the obvious one on any Atlantic barrier coast, which is storms, evacuation routes, and wind insurance, plus a summer tourist season that fills the streets. And 9 months of the year, it's yours. It is worth being precise about the insurance comparison rather than hand-waving at it, because Southport is genuinely coastal and nobody should pretend otherwise. Wind and flood coverage here costs real money, and a house near the water will be underwritten carefully. The difference is that North Carolina's market still functions, with carriers competing and policies available, while Florida spent the past several years watching insurers withdraw entirely, and premiums climb past $7,000 on average statewide. Paying a serious premium in a working market is a different situation from being unable to find coverage at any price, and that distinction is what moved a lot of people north across the state line. Now we cross into the state that took more retirees than anywhere else in America last year. South Carolina added a net 5,427 residents aged 65 and over in 2025, topping every other state in the country. And the next 5 towns are where a lot of that landed. Camden is the oldest inland town in South Carolina, chartered in 1733, and it wears that age well across a downtown of antebellum houses and long shaded streets. About 8,200 people live here. The typical home costs $248,000 on the June index, and Columbia sits about 40 minutes southwest, which puts a real airport, university hospitals, and a symphony inside an easy drive while keeping the price of a small town. The local identity runs on horses. The Carolina Cup steeplechase has been run here since the 1930s and turns the Springdale Racecourse into a spring event that draws the whole state, and the training barns keep working year-round. South Carolina's tax structure is what makes this whole state block work. Social Security is completely exempt, with no income testing and no phase-out. The income tax moved to a flat 5% rate for 2026, and anyone 65 and older gets an additional $15,000 deduction against other retirement income. Stack those, and a couple living on 2 checks plus a moderate pension can end up owing the state very little. The honest counterweight is that Camden is quiet in a way that some people find restorative, and others find like waiting, and the summer heat in the South Carolina Midlands is real and long. $248,000 though. That is the price of admission to the #1 destination state in the country. Camden's other quiet advantage is position. It sits far enough inland to be outside the hurricane conversation entirely, which for a retiree who has just spent a decade watching the Atlantic every August is worth something no amenity list captures. There is no evacuation route out of Camden because there is nothing to evacuate from. Watery Lake sits east of town for the boat, and Charleston is about 2 hours off when the coast is wanted rather than lived on. That last arrangement, close enough to visit and far enough to skip the insurance, describes a lot of what the halfback migration is actually about. Before sunrise, riders still walk thoroughbreds down packed sand lanes in the middle of town, a routine that has run here since 1892. That was the year the winter colony formed, when wealthy northern families started coming south to Aiken for the mild winters and brought their horses with them, and the town has been organized around that arrangement ever since. The Aiken training track, on the National Register of Historic Places, still draws East Coast stables every winter. Streets in the historic district are deliberately left unpaved for the horses. The typical home costs $284,000 on Zillow's June index, which puts brick cottages and small acreage within reach of a retirement income rather than a racing fortune. What makes Aiken more than a theme is Hitchcock Woods, 2,100 acres of longleaf pine forest inside the city limits, one of the largest urban forests in the country, with 70 miles of sand trails open to walkers, runners, and riders. A retiree here can walk an old-growth forest every morning without leaving town. Aiken Regional Medical Centers covers healthcare locally. Augusta sits 25 minutes across the Georgia line for larger systems, and Columbia is about an hour northeast. South Carolina's exemption of Social Security applies in full, and the $15,000 retirement deduction at 65 applies on top. The honest counterweight is that the Midland summer arrives in May and does not leave until late September, and it is hot and humid without any elevation to soften it. Aiken's answer has always been the same as it was in 1892, which is that you plan your day around the morning. There's a second reason Aiken keeps drawing people that has nothing to do with horses. The Savannah River Site, a large federal facility west of town, has employed engineers and scientists here for decades, and a great many of them stayed after retiring. That gives Aiken something most small southern towns lack entirely, which is a retired professional class with time on its hands. The practical result is a town of about 30,000 that supports a symphony, a community theater, an active art scene, and the kind of volunteer organizations that only exist where educated retirees have decided to build them. For someone arriving from Florida who worries about landing in a place where the only social structure is a church and a golf course, Aiken is the answer to that specific fear. The Thoroughbred Racing Hall of Fame downtown covers the horses for anyone who wants them, and the Aiken Steeplechase runs each spring and fall. Live oaks hang with Spanish moss over streets of antebellum houses, and the tide moves through the marsh grass at the end of them twice a day. Beaufort sits in the South Carolina low country between Charleston and Savannah, about 14,000 people on a sea island surrounded by water, and it has been on national best places to retire lists for so long that appearing on another one is almost redundant. The numbers explain why it stays there. Cost of living here runs about 3% below the national average, and housing costs about 15% below it, while the typical home sits at $417,000 on the June index, a figure that reflects genuine waterfront rather than a compromise. Beaufort Memorial Hospital anchors healthcare in town, and the medical infrastructure around it is unusually deep for a community this size, in part because the area serves a large military population from Parris Island and the air station. South Carolina's tax treatment is the same one that made the last two entries work, and it is worth repeating because it is doing enormous work across this entire state block. No tax on Social Security, no income testing, no phase-out, a flat 5% rate on other income for 2026, and a $15,000 deduction against retirement income once you turn 65. The counterweight is that this is a low, flat, coastal place, so hurricane exposure is real and flood elevation matters street by street. Summer humidity is genuine low country humidity, but for a person leaving Florida who does not want to give up the water, the moss, or the warmth, Beaufort delivers all three, in a state that is currently taking more retirees than anywhere else in America. What Beaufort does better than almost any town on this list is give you the coastal South without the resort town emptiness. This is a working place with a downtown that functions in January, a military community that never leaves, and a history that runs from Spanish exploration through the Civil War era, when Beaufort was occupied early and the surrounding sea islands became one of the first places in the country where formerly enslaved people bought land and built their own communities. The Gullah culture that grew out of those islands is still here, in the food, the language, and the crafts, and it gives the area a depth that a purpose-built retirement development cannot manufacture at any price. Hunting Island State Park sits 15 minutes east, with the only publicly accessible beach in the county. Del Webb has been building retirement communities in America since the 1960s, and where the company decides to build next is a reasonable proxy for where retirement money is actually going. In Somerville, they built Del Webb Charleston at Nexton, 1,400 homes across 350 acres inside a larger master-planned community, gated, 55 and over, with an expansive clubhouse, indoor and outdoor pools, pickleball and tennis courts, and a fitness center. The Charleston Home Builders Association named it the best 55-plus community in the region. The typical Somerville home costs $384,000 on Zillow's June index, and Charleston sits under 40 minutes southeast, which is the entire proposition. You get one of the most beautiful cities in the country as your day trip, your airport, and your specialist hospital network, while paying small-town Dorchester County prices to live. Somerville itself predates all of this by 2 centuries. It grew as a summer refuge for low-country planters escaping the coastal heat of mosquitoes. The pine forests were believed to purify the air, and the town still calls itself Flower Town for the azaleas that take over every spring. South Carolina's tax structure applies in full. The honest counterweight is growth, because this corridor has been building fast for a decade. Traffic on the main routes toward Charleston has thickened noticeably, and a retiree who wants a sleepy town should look at Camden instead. What Somerville offers is the opposite trade, a place with momentum, new medical construction, and enough arriving retirees that the community around you is still forming rather than already closed. That last point is underrated and worth sitting with for a moment. When a person relocates relocates at 68 to a town where everyone has known each other for 40 years, making friends is genuine work. When a person relocates to a place where 1,000 other households arrived in the same 3-year window, everyone is in the same position and the social barrier drops to nothing. It is the single most common regret in retirement relocation, arriving somewhere lovely and staying lonely, and a fast-growing community is the most reliable insurance against it. Trident Health and Roper St. Francis both operate facilities in the Somerville area, so the medical column is covered locally before you ever drive toward Charleston. And number 1 is where the largest 55 and over community in South Carolina has spent 30 years selling out, one phase at a time. Sun City Hilton Head covers 5,700 acres in Bluffton, just inland from Hilton Head Island in Beaufort County. It opened in 1995. It was planned for 8,600 homes, and roughly 7,700 of them are already built and occupied. 54 holes of golf sit inside it, along with 3 amenity centers, a sports complex, a 560-seat theater, community gardens, miles of trails, and more than 100 clubs and resident organizations. It is, functionally, a town of retirees that a builder constructed on purpose. And here is why it closes this countdown rather than any other entry. Read through what residents there say about how they chose it, and the same story keeps repeating. They looked at Florida, they priced Florida, they came here instead. Sun City is not the only one either, because Bluffton also holds Latitude Margaritaville, The Haven, and Riverband, an entire cluster of retirement communities in one small corner of one South Carolina county, all competing for the same buyer who used to automatically drive 4 more hours south. The typical Bluffton home costs $502,000 on the June index, the highest number in this video, and the honest counterweight is exactly that. This is not the budget option, and Property Owners Association dues and amenity fees run on top of the mortgage every single year. Now think back across all 20 towns. Cordell's $145,000 house is on a Georgia lake. Crossville, where the median age is 70. Camden, sitting far enough inland that hurricane season is somebody else's problem. Every one of them is a version of the same decision, made by people who did the Florida math one more time and got a different answer than they got 20 years ago. Bluffton is that decision at its most organized, its most expensive, and its most complete. 8,600 homes worth of people reached the same conclusion, and they built a town around it. And the geography quietly does the rest. Bluffton sits inland from the barrier islands along the May River, so you get the low country, the marsh, the oysters, and Hilton Head's beaches 20 minutes away while sitting on the mainland side of the insurance conversation rather than the ocean side of it. Savannah's airport is 40 minutes south, and Old Town Bluffton on the bluff above the river still has its oak-shaded streets and galleries that have nothing to do with any gated community. 20 towns, 4 states, and one number underneath it, all of it. Florida gained a net 815 retirees last year. Not 815,000, 815 people in a state that built its entire identity on being where Americans go to retire. The money did not stop moving south, it just stopped at a different exit in Georgia and Tennessee and the Carolinas, where the insurance is payable and the states leave a Social Security check alone. Now the honest part, because you deserve it after 20 towns of numbers. Home values are Zillow's June figures, and they move every month. Tax rules carry income tests, filing deadlines, and county-level variation that no video can cover completely. And the property tax relief programs mentioned here all have their own qualifying rules. Verify every one of them against your own situation before you so much as call a moving company. And I am not going to pretend Florida is finished, because plenty of people are perfectly happy there, and the sunshine is still free. If you have made this move or you are thinking about it, tell me in the comments which state you would pick and why. That is the conversation that makes the next list sharper. Subscribe if you want it and bring your calculator. The playbook has plenty of pages left.